Welcome back, Canonites. While we just recently got a taste of 343's response to the Halo Infinite technical preview, this past Friday brought a much more detailed breakdown, highlighting several key points the community brought up during the flight. So, while you might hear some repeated information, this is packed with so much more than we've seen yet. And while it doesn't cover everything, that would be an insanely long post, it does highlight several key points. So, let's dive in. Now, lucky for me, the outcomes report is organized into a series of categories, so we'll pretty much just kind of go through each one at a time. Starting things out is feedback on accessibility options within Infinite. Feedback on the new outlines system was generally positive, something I absolutely agree with. Traditional red versus blue is very limiting for people with various sight issues, and that actually includes me. In pre-343 titles, I always had trouble seeing blue team players in shadows on maps, both near and far. Halo 4 and 5 helped a lot in my opinion, but outlines are something I enjoy even more. On the subject of outlines though, the Sandbox team later goes over more specific feedback. Players noted difficulty in telling when shots were impacting shields and the readability of the overshield, along with a desire for more customization options. Luckily, 343 have already made improvements along these lines, which we should see in the next flight. There was also a desire to turn off outlines entirely, which is going to have to wait until post-launch. I have seen concerns about how this might impact machinima, but unless these outlines are going to be present in theater mode, I don't think there should be much of an impact, but we'll have to wait and see. Finally, on this subject, players also want to see gamer tags and service tags above Spartans, just like in previous Halo titles. This was apparently a bug that 343 will have fixed for launch, if not the next flight. Controller and keyboard and mouse remapping was also very popular, I think for obvious reasons. 343 say that they want to remove as many barriers as possible for players with disabilities, and make the game fully compatible with the Xbox Adaptive Controller, which are very admirable goals. From what I've seen, it seems like 343 are succeeding on that front. As for areas of improvement, many requested an auto sprint option so they wouldn't have to hold the thumbstick in a forward position. There was also a desire to alter the colors of the damage system colors and mark colors independently. I'm not really sure what damage system color is here, but I assume that's shield color. One thing I definitely want to see is independent controls for player outlines and their shield colors for both teammates and enemies. I want to be able to retain the classic golden shields of Spartans on both teams while keeping red and blue outlines. Anyway, 343 note that auto sprint and damage system and mark colors are great feedback, but they won't be there at launch. They are being tracked for post-launch, however, which is good to hear. From there we move on to audio. Music was loved across the board, and there's not much else to say on that front. The music is fantastic. As far as in-game audio, however, while much of the experience was praised, there was some feedback. Specifically, players wanted the Needler to sound more crystallized and glassy like its previous incarnations, and I feel that's pretty universal feedback. The Plasma Pistol's single-fire mode was also criticized, along with the Gravity Hammer, and sounds for all of these will be updated in the next flight. On a personal note, I hope the Super Combine effect is much more explosive and much louder, as I found it rather lacking compared to previous games. Something else people wanted was independent audio controls for the different in-game voices, personal AI, Spartan Chatter, the multiplayer announcer, which the team is looking at for post-launch. Later in the article, the multiplayer team goes into more specifics on personal AI settings. There was a notable desire to preview an AI's voice in the menus, which we will see in the next flight. 343 also added more variety to the lines the AIs will speak, a reflection of certain lines popping up too often, much like Spartans. There was also a desire to reduce the amount of information or types of information the AI give, which 343 are looking to support post-launch. From there, the live team discusses feedback on the Battle Pass and challenges, which have been points of contention recently. Specifically, fans have been concerned about whether challenges are the only way to progress, along with double XP boosters counting down in the menus. As far as the challenges go, there were some issues 343 detected during the flight that prevented people from leveling up as intended, further noting that challenges in the flight weren't fully reflective of the final product. Specifically, they have a model where there will be daily play X number of games that repeat throughout the day. This is good news in my book, as a big concern I have over challenges is how they might affect player behavior in-game. It's annoying enough when players ignore objectives so they can farm kills, but worse when the game is basically advocating such play. That said, weekly challenges will feature more specific challenges like get X kills with Y weapon, which does concern me. Stuff like this immediately reminds me of commendations from Halo Reach and Halo 4, which definitely had their downsides as I previously described. Still, I'll have to judge the system on its own merits at launch. Who knows, my concerns might be addressed in some manner I have yet to see, or they could be entirely unfounded. In regards to the XP boost timers counting down outside of matches, this is something 343 will have to address post-launch. Personally, I don't really see an issue with boosters having a strict time limit. Yes, I know people have an issue with it, and I'm not dismissing those concerns. It's just not a concern to me. If nothing were to change, I'd personally be fine with that. If 343 improves things, that's cool too. Next up, we dive into feedback on bots, the focal point of the previous flight. Now, if you've watched my videos on the August development update or the most recent Inside Infinite, this will all sound rather familiar. While bots were positively received overall, there were some points of criticism. First, players felt that bots were too accurate with guns and grenades. While 343 is looking at grenade behavior, which even they felt was a bit too strong, when it comes to gunplay, they don't want to make the bots too easy, especially since there's already an easier difficulty that wasn't present in the flight. There was also feedback about bots not using equipment enough, which 343 are looking into for both launch and beyond. They hope to continue to improve bots throughout Halo Infinite's life. Second, bots tended to all go in the same direction at the start of a match, which could result in easy overkills and team wipes. 343 are looking into this to break up the initial routes that bots will take off spawn. There were also instances of bots seemingly getting confused during a match, for lack of a better phrase, at which point they just stopped moving. Many of the larger bugs that caused this have been resolved already, and the team continues to make improvements as launch comes closer. And again, behavior will continue to improve over time. Lastly, there was a lot of feedback about Spartan bots not being as difficult as players expected after the ODST bots. Some of this was a result of tuning, while other parts were just the result of a desire for these bots to be training partners first and foremost. 343 is looking into more difficulties for bots post-launch, however, which we've previously touched on. We next come to weapon drills, which once again were largely well received, but also had some points of feedback. Notably, players wanted to see the teaching of alt-fire modes be made more clear, an easier way to swap between weapon drills, and desired untimed weapon drills along with drills for equipment and movement. Alt-fire information will be added to the game's quick tips, and the team will continue to make improvements post-launch. Swapping more easily between weapon drills is also being explored by the UX/UI team. Untimed weapon drills and drills for equipment and movement are being looked at for post-launch. 343 also note that the next flight will feature another Academy mode called Training Mode, which sounds like it'll allow players to more easily experiment with things like equipment and movement. Now, let's talk radar, or combat sensor as 343 calls it. In this flight, the radar was modeled after a particular iteration of Halo 5, where players would only show up while sprinting and firing. This was overall not well received, and 343 are bringing the radar back to a more traditional implementation. This means players will appear on radar unless crouch walking, which we should see next flight. One thing that did concern me is it sounds like this behavior will just be for social. I hope I'm just reading too far into this, as I feel the radar should work the same across social and competitive, outside of HCS-style playlists, which I consider separate from competitive. There was also a desire for height indicators on radar like in previous games, which I absolutely agree with. Now then, let's talk medals. A big talking point among the community was the look and display of medals. In Infinite, medals are colored based on rarity, and when they appear, they're fairly small. People generally didn't have the most positive reaction to either of these changes, with a lot of the medals just kind of blending together. 343 have been working on improving the look of the medals though, making them look more like Halo 3 or Halo Reach medals, though the rarity colors remain intact. As you can see here, there are definite improvements, but I do share concerns that many just won't stand out as they used to. While 343 can't promise we'll see these newer medals in the next flight, they are pushing to fix them up before launch. As far as placement and size goes, that's likely to be left for post-launch, it seems. From there, we dive into a number of topics concerning Halo Infinite's sandbox, starting with aiming. Many players reported various issues with aiming, and I can say from the weapon drills I was able to do, aiming was rather difficult both on controller and keyboard and mouse, though especially the latter. In response, 343 have increased the default sensitivities for both inputs and made other performance increases, which we'll get to see next flight. They've also added axial dead zone controls in settings for the next flight. If you're unsure what this means, don't worry, neither did I. After doing a little research, this basically controls how free, quote-unquote, your aiming is. For example, if you were to set the value to 0, your weapon will aim in the same direction as your controller stick, to the most minute detail. If you increase that value, your stick can slightly deviate from a particular direction without your aim moving. So for example, say you're aiming straight forward. With an axial dead zone of 0, if your control stick deviates from a perfect straightforward direction even slightly, the character's aim will deviate as well. If you increase that number, you'll need to move the control stick further in a different direction to move where you're aiming. Basically, it's how precise a response your aim makes to the movement of the control stick or mouse. I don't know if I explained that well or not, but I hope it gets the point across. There was also specific feedback about aiming with the sniper rifle and skewer, especially when zoomed in. 343 have made some performance and aiming improvements here that we'll be able to see next flight. There was also a bit of confusion on how zooming worked on non-scoped weapons. Or in other words, does the smart scope on certain weapons improve the aim or effective range or anything like that, a la Halo 5? Rest assured, zooming in with an unscoped weapon will not provide any sort of benefit or buff. You're just zoomed in with a decreased field of view, and the weapon otherwise performs the same. Lastly on this subject, feedback on the gravity hammer was mixed. I know when I first saw the multiplayer preview trailer, I wasn't a fan of how long the swing was, but seeing that it now has a larger damage radius, I think the new behavior is a bit of an improvement. In previous games, other than the hammer's gravity effects, there wasn't much to differentiate it from the sword. I look forward to experiencing this myself, however, in the next flight. From there, we move briefly into movement. Sprint was positively received, and for my own part, the video comparisons of default movement versus sprint looked great. In general, however, there were a lot of reports of movement feeling clunky, while equally there were reports of movement feeling smooth. At the moment, no changes have been made to the movement itself, as 343 are looking to improve their networking model, hoping to see if that reduces the issues people had. Again, for my own part, movement did feel kinda clunky with the weapon drills, and I've never had a harder time aiming with a controller or keyboard and mouse in a Halo game than I have with Infinite. I don't know if weapon drills would be affected by networking, but I thought I'd just put this out there. Screen shaking was also a concern during the flight, as it would remain present even when turned off in the settings. This was the result of a bug that 343 have addressed for the next flight. Next up, we have equipment. Reception was overall positive, especially for the grapple hook, but many felt the drop wall deployed too slowly and was too weak, something I definitely agree with based on the gameplay I saw. The behavior of the drop wall was designed to make the equipment something players would use proactively, i.e. setting up defenses in advance, rather than reactively like the bubble shield. This is certainly an admirable goal, but I don't think the drop wall can effectively be used as a proactive piece of equipment in Slayer game types. In objective game types, I can see the drop wall being used as 343 envisions, but in Slayer, I just don't see any reason to use it proactively. That said, 343 have reduced the drop wall's deployment time for the next flight to see if that helps at all. Further tuning can be made afterwards, of course. Still, my biggest concern with the drop wall is the look of the panels. Its appearance in the July 2020 demo remains my favorite iteration, and I hope the visual design receives an upgrade before launch. As I have said in the past, the current design looks more like a proof of concept than something I'd expect to see in a final build. After that, we dive into some feedback surrounding the HUD. While generally well received, there was some feedback. Players felt that the weapon cradle was too small and wanted to be able to see their second grenade type. 343 agree with both of these points of feedback, though they note that this will have to wait until post-launch, sadly. There was also a desire for HUD customization, which 343 said can be explored during Infinite's lifetime. Finally, we have the menus. I will say that they were a significant improvement over Halo 5, though I'm personally not a fan of the pure black and white look as opposed to the blue-themed menus of older games, and even MCC. It's cool that we can now navigate the entire menu system while searching for matches, though that felt rather clunky too in my opinion. Two main points of feedback came up from the community. First, many wanted a vertical menu like the classic titles rather than the horizontal menu we currently have for Infinite. While this can't change for launch, improvements can be made as the game evolves. Second, equipping items was noted as being difficult, which 343 reports was largely buggy behavior. For my part, bugs aside, the way you'd equip items was just not fun. Like, if I wanted to apply a piece of armor, I'd have to scroll to find that armor, select the piece, then select a checkbox on another menu to actually equip it. I really wish I could instead just select a piece of armor or a skin or an AI or whatever from the horizontal menu without having to open up the lore and description. In general though, I'm just not a fan of the horizontal navigation, and I look forward to any change 343 can make. And since I saw it mentioned in the article, please 343 never return to Halo 5's grid system. It's such a hassle to navigate and nothing really stands out. I'd take Infinite's current menus over Halo 5's anytime and every time. With that though, we conclude the outcomes report. There are some topics that the community has highlighted, such as the lack of grenade jumping physics and even the lackluster physics of the gravity hammer that sadly go unaddressed in this update. Hopefully those can be fixed for the next flight, or even addressed before launch. Overall, however, 343 is very clearly taking in feedback from the community and doing all they can to respond. It does kinda suck how often we heard post-launch in this update, but I don't see the features being delayed until after launch as having a huge negative impact on the game's success. Certainly no more than co-op or Forge's delay. But those are my thoughts. What are yours? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, stick around for the Patreon shoutout, and until next time, this has been Halo Canon. First, I'd love to give a big thank you to our Horospis patrons. First, there's Hope, then we have Freight, Discombobulated Sycophant, Justin Montgomery, Ada Frame, Man in the Dark, Keisha Dila, and Daddy Anarchy. I apologize if I butchered any of your names, but thank you all for your amazing support of the channel. Next, I'd like to give a thank you to our theoretical patrons. If you'd like to see your name here or get a direct shout out, check out patreon.com/halocanon. You can simply support the channel or get additional benefits, such as behind the scenes material, including raw audio for upcoming videos, or even shoutouts like this. All patrons now get early access to certain videos as well, and more benefits are to come. However, your continued viewership is more than enough for me. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up, or maybe even subscribing to the channel if you aren't already. If you really enjoy my work, turn on that notification bell so you can be among the first to see new videos when they release, or in some cases premiere. But for all my fellow Canonites, keep on being awesome.